Hello, my name is Benjamin Williams. I'm the senior minister for the Central Church of Christ in Ada, Oklahoma, and I was asked to prepare and give a lesson on the history of epidemics, in particularly in Christian history, and how we might learn from that. I'm happy to do that today. First thought I'd want to share that I think is going to be helpful for any discussion of this topic and how we respond as Christians is to think about virtue and goodness and good behavior and discretion as being on a scale between two extremes. This is a way Aristotle conceived of the virtues, and I'd like to see more people think this way. That virtue and goodness is always the mean or the average between two extremes. So in our case, I think we all want to respond in faith. That's the right answer to any problem. So when Aristotle talked about it, he would talk about it in terms of courage. Courage stands between fear and foolishness or foolhardiness. That running away from danger you need to face is not courage. And running into a danger you don't need to face is not courage either. Courage is facing the danger you need to face. And I think that can be said for faith as well, that in our situation, there is no life without risk. But there are unnecessary risks. And as a Christian, we don't view and fear death the same way that other people do. And so when a disease or pandemic comes along, we don't view it the same way an unbeliever would. But neither do we have to take unnecessary risks. So if you'll keep that in mind, I actually think it'll be really helpful in moving through the story of church history and seeing how people responded to different situations. That discretion is always involved. Before we even get to church history, though, probably to give you some background on the biblical case, you can go back behind church history into the book of Leviticus. Isn't it funny that this book that we always wonder, what is this book here for, suddenly becomes kind of an important book in a moment of pandemic and isolation and social distancing? Because Leviticus chapter 13 and 14 covers the question of leprosy, which was the great medical concern of the ancient world, at least it seems that it was. Chapter 13 talks about identifying leprosy and other skin diseases, and then chapter 14 talks about the laws for cleansing, especially for a person who had been cured or healed, rather, of leprosy. There really wasn't a cure, but some people did recover, apparently, and there were rules about that in the text. Two observations that might help us when we say, is there a biblical precedent for the sort of things we're being asked to do today by the CDC? And the answer is yes, actually. First of all, social distancing. Leviticus 13, 45 through 46. The leprous person who has the disease shall wear torn clothes, and let the hair of his head hang loose, and he shall cover his upper lip and cry out, "Unclean, unclean." He shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. So ancient people knew, and God told ancient people to know, that in times of disease, one thing that you could do to help people was to create distance to prevent the spread of the disease. And then another simple response was hygiene. So this is Leviticus 14, 8 through 9. And he who is to be cleansed shall wash his clothes, and shave off all his hair, and bathe himself in water, and he shall be clean. And after that he may come into the camp, but live outside his tent 7 days. And on the seventh day he shall shave off all his hair from his head, his beard, and his eyebrows. He shall shave off all his hair, and then he shall wash his clothes, and bathe his body in water, and he shall be clean. I'm really hoping that we don't end up at the beard shaving level of epidemic in our current situation. I don't know if I'd make it, but simple hygiene. We're already telling everybody, create distance and wash your hands. And Leviticus says basically that, be clean, separate yourselves, and that's going to be the best thing for a group of people to do. Are these people being faithless in Leviticus when they practice those things? No, actually, they're being faithful. They're being responsive to God's word and to their current situation by taking reasonable measures. And so that's a good precedent that in church history, several people will refer back to. Here in a few minutes when we get to the story of Martin Luther and the plagues of Germany, he refers back to Leviticus 13:14 and says, yeah, that's a good model for what we should be doing. Moving then more specifically into church history, there are a couple of very early plagues. A great book to read on this, if you're looking for some reading later, is Rodney Stark, The Rise of Christianity. And he has a whole chapter detailing how one of the reasons Christianity happens, that it grows in the 2nd and 3rd century, is because of the plagues and the way Christians responded to it. First plague is sometimes called the Antonine Plague. This is 2nd century, again, barely 100 years after the life of the apostles. It lasts from about 166 to 190 AD. At its height in 189, records give us an idea of as many as 2,000 people per day were dying in Rome, if you can imagine that. And all the pagan wise men of that day, the medical experts, simply failed and ran. Galen is a famous and well-known doctor of that era who a lot of Romans were looking to for encouragement and guidance, and he left town. He left for his own home out in the countryside and got away from the sick people and left them to die. Marcus Aurelius, who is emperor at this time, says, well, we know why this is happening. It's Christians. This weird Christian group, they haven't been loyal to the Roman gods, and so now the gods are smiting us. And he tried to blame Christians. So you got two things going on. People blaming Christians at the government level, and then doctors and nurses running away from sick people, right? How do Christians respond? Well, the Christians did the opposite. The Christians didn't try to place blame. They said, this is not the gods smiting us for sin. This is the result of sin in a rebellious world. We have a loving God who would like to heal us, and they tried to work towards that. So Christians, while being persecuted, would attend to their pagan neighbors and take care of them the best they could, and show that kind of faith in action of how they treated other people. And Christianity booms at the end of this plague. It just explodes through this one and the next one, as Christians kind of showed up the pagans in the way they responded. The second plague to mention is the Cyprian plague. About the 3rd century, begins around 250 AD. It actually begins near Easter, which is kind of fascinating. And it continues for about 2 decades, on and off, of just continued plague throughout the Roman world. At its height, something like 5,000 per day death toll in Rome itself. While that's going on, Eusebius would later record the behavior of Christians, and again, it's kind of the same story. While the pagans were running in fear and terror, Christians were doing the best they could to help each other out. So Eusebius writes, most of our brethren showed love and loyalty in not sparing themselves while helping one another, tending to the sick with no thought of danger, and gladly departing this life with them after being infected with their disease. Many who nursed others to health died themselves, but thus transferring their death to themselves. The best of our own brothers lost their lives in this way, some presbyters, deacons, and laymen, a form of death based on the strong faith and piety that seems in every way equal to martyrdom. They would also take up the bodies of the saints, close their eyes, shut their mouths, and carry them on their shoulders. They would embrace them, wash and dress them in burial clothes, and soon receive the same services themselves. So while society was completely falling apart, Christianity provided some stability in caring for people that no one else wanted to care for, even while it was actually costing them a personal risk. Eusebius goes on to mention how the Romans behaved. The heathen were the exact opposite. They pushed away those with the first signs of the disease and fled from their dearest. They even threw them half dead into the roads and treated unburied corpses like refuse in hope of avoiding the plague of death, which, for all their efforts, was difficult to escape. So just to make a quick point, this is not a direct comparison to our situation, because the challenge here was not, are you going to sequester at home and isolate yourself, but rather, would people literally abandon their own family members and run? And that's what the pagans were doing. And the Christian says, no, we know we have to respond, but that's not the right response. People are sick. We're going to try to take care of them the best we can. And that's consistent throughout the Cyprian plague. If you want to skip forward in time a little bit to the time of the Black Plague. The Black Plague starts in Europe in the 13th century, really the 14th century to be more accurate, and continues off and on for the next 3 centuries. So from the 14th century to the 16th century, and some would even say beyond, you have this kind of same looking plague that just rears its head up and down throughout Europe in different places and rolls around. It ebbs and flows back and forth. But you have these intermittent episodes of plague, and they are absolutely horrific. There's nothing like it in the modern world. In fact, I suspect the reason that stuff like COVID-19 frightens us so much is because it's so far out of our experience compared to stuff like this that used to be more normal and terrifying. The Black Death claimed between 30 and 50% of the European population. Not that 30 to 50% of the population was sick. 30 to 50% of the population died from the Black Death. I mean, that's incredible. Half of cities dying. Absolutely incredible. And during that time, in the early portions of it, before the Protestant Reformation, it was the monasteries and abbeys throughout Europe that were taking people in and doing their best for them, like Christians had done for centuries, and trying to ease the burden of those plagues as they swept over Europe. In 1527, the plague has come to Germany, and the Germans are turning to Martin Luther for guidance. And the question is, should we flee town when the plague comes to town? What should Lutheran German Christians do? And Luther writes this wonderful letter. I would encourage you to go find it online. It's called Whether One May Flee from a Deadly Plague. And it's really great reading from Martin Luther. Yeah, it's dated. It's from the 16th century. A lot of things he didn't know. But I think it's kind of wonderful to read. And what he does, like we said in the beginning, is try to balance fear on one end, foolishness on the other, and faith in between. And he has 2 main points. First of all, fear should not overrule our love for neighbor. We as Christians care for people. And so our first concern is, how can I love my neighbor? In Luther's context, that was going to visit people who had medical needs and making sure they were taken care of. In other contexts, it might be, again, the things we talked about out of Leviticus: social distancing, good hygiene, making sure you aren't spreading the disease to somebody else. But the first goal was loving your neighbor. And he was insistent that even if people were leaving town because of the plague, enough people should stay in order to care for others. That included ministers, make sure that you're taking care of your people, government officials, and other essential services, what we're calling them today, make sure that was continued. The second thing he stipulated was that rashness should not overrule good sense. So everyone should follow reasonable precautions and not take unnecessary risks. There were some people saying, well, this is God's will and this is just the way it's going to be. And he said, yeah, no, God gave us intelligence and medicine too. Don't be stupid, and encourage that. Let me give you a few quotations and highlights from that particular letter that I think are pretty wonderful. He says to flee from death. First of all, he says you don't have to flee from death, because as Christians, we have kind of a personal we have a personal assurance of salvation. But then he goes on to say that lots of people in the Bible flee death when they have the option. Right? David flees from Absalom. Saul is let down out of a window. He says to flee from death to save one's life is a natural tendency, implanted by God and not forbidden unless it be against God and neighbor. And he mentions Ephesians 5:29 there, that no man ever hated his own body. And that's something God gave us. It's the way we're supposed to think. He says, how much more appropriate it is, therefore, to seek to preserve life and avoid death, if this can be done without harm to our neighbor. If there's a way to keep yourself safe, you should do that, as long as you're not harming somebody in the process. He encourages people, whether they ran or stayed, not to judge each other and not to condemn one another for that decision. But he's careful to say examples in Holy Scripture abound, or abundantly prove, that to flee from death is not wrong in itself. He compares the plague coming to his town in Wittenberg as like a house being on fire. And he says, what happens when a house is on fire? Okay, well, it kind of depends on your situation. If you're in the house, you don't say, well, I believe in God and he'll rescue me. You run out of the house because God gave you a brain to do that. You get out of danger. If you're a neighbor and you see someone in a burning house, you run in to try to rescue that person because you love your neighbor, and that's more important than your fear. If, on the other hand, we'll make it more modern, the fire department has arrived, or if Luther says if there are sufficient people there already, you let them take care of it. You don't unnecessarily run into a burning building just because you want to look brave. And that's the analogy he uses with the virus. He says, if his house is on fire, love compels me to run to help him extinguish the flames. If there are enough other people around to put the fire out, I may either go home or remain to help. No neighbor can live alongside another without risk to his safety. Well, he says, just reality. There's risk in the world. And so we all use discretion. And we let love triumph over fear. We do what's right for our neighbor. We don't take on unnecessary risk. So an application then, he says, now if a deadly epidemic strikes, we should stay where we are and make our preparations and take courage in the fact that we are mutually bound together. Let us not be so desperate as to desert our own. So number one, again, brotherly love, love for the neighbor. We take care of each other first. But then he says, other sin on the other hand, right? He says, they are much too rash and reckless, tempting God and disregarding everything which might counteract death and plague. They disdain the use of medicines. They do not avoid places and persons infected by the plague, but lightheartedly make sport of it and wish to prove how independent they are. This is not trusting God, but tempting him. God has created medicines and provided us with intelligence to guard and take good care of the body so that we can live in good health. For one makes no use of intelligence or medicine when he could do so without detriment to his neighbor. Such a person injures his own body and must beware lest he become a suicide in God's eyes. Luther says not taking reasonable precautions is borderline suicide, and God doesn't favor that. You're supposed to be sensible and use your intelligence, follow the protocols whenever possible. He concludes by saying, use medicine, take potions which can help you, fumigate house, yard, and street, shun persons and places wherever your neighbor does not need your presence or has recovered, and act like a man who wants to help put out the burning city. He concludes, he who has contracted the disease and recovered should keep away from others and not admit them into his presence unless it be necessary. And sure enough, he quotes Leviticus 13 and 14 as examples of that. So what's Luther telling us? He's a strong advocate of faith, and he's a strong advocate of loving your neighbor, even in the face of terrible danger. He just says there's no reason to accept unnecessary risks. So do all the precautions, do all the reasonable things, follow the protocols, and still be willing to help your neighbor. That faith stands between unreasonable fear and unreasonable rashness, and that's where Christians were supposed to live. There are also two more modern episodes of epidemics that incidentally directly affect churches of Christ, so I thought that would be worth mentioning as well. The first is the Spanish flu. In 1918, in the course of 3 or 4 months, the influenza outbreak killed almost 700,000 in the U.S. and 50 million globally. It was an enormous shock. In Nashville, where lots of Churches of Christ and a lot of Church of Christ history happens, the Tennessee Health Department advised churches to close for about 2 weeks and not have services. And nobody rioted, nobody protested. 92 churches did so. One that didn't, but for a good reason, the Russell Street Church of Christ became a temporary Red Cross hospital. And so they opened up for that purpose. And so again, you see that balance of, yeah, we're going to take the reasonable precautions. We're also going to love our neighbor. And that was a standard rule of thumb through that period of time. M.C. Curfews, at the time, minister in Churches of Christ, said, "It behooves us to cheerfully submit to this order and to exert all our energies in an earnest and sympathetic effort to cooperate with the benevolent purpose of our government to check the deplorable disease." And he would go on to recommend that his congregants worship in their homes, quote, "as was sometimes done in the days of the apostles." He said, this is perfectly normal. You know, basically Christians have been knowing what to do about this for 2,000 years. This isn't anything new for us. And then one other that I thought just ought to be mentioned, during the Ebola outbreak in Africa in 2014, something like 11,325 people died in West Africa in the years between 2014 and 2016. And guess what? It was a Christian trying to love his neighbor there, serving as a medical missionary, ended up contracting Ebola, has since recovered, and then 5 years later decided he wanted to go back and is now in Africa again, serving in Zambia. So I guess my point is that Christians have always found a way to balance these basic concerns throughout church history. Number one, you love your neighbor. What is the best way to love your neighbor? If his house is on fire, I'm going to go help him. If somebody's already helping him, I don't need to put myself in unnecessary risk. And that model is fantastic. There's fear on one hand, foolishness on the other, and faith walks that line in between. We're going to keep all the protocols we possibly can. We're going to try to keep ourselves safe. We're also going to attend to people that have need, because Christians live with a different assessment of risk. And so today, what do churches do? Those things. We find ways to not live in fear and not live in foolishness, but to live in faith and good sense. And I hope you guys stay safe, but also do wonderful good deeds. It is worth mentioning that every time there's one of these colossal, terrible outbreaks of disease, because Christians handle it well, churches grow afterwards. But that depends on us handling it well. And so that's what I would encourage you to do. Take a page out of history, learn from the past, and let's handle this as well as we can. God bless you. Go in peace.